All right, everybody. So we're going to get underway with a podcasting session, and it's going to start out really noisy because people are over here still mingling around. But I just want to say welcome to this session. I am actually recording this, so this hopefully will become an episode of the podcast that I do. And what I want to encourage is you to ask me questions. And if you have, if something's not clear, then feel free to interrupt me. And the point is I want to educate you and download everything that I've learned about doing a podcast in the last year and a half so that you feel empowered that if you wanted to, then you could go and set one up. So just a little bit of background about me. I have an American accent, but I actually grew up here in New Zealand. So it pays not to make assumptions when you first hear people who have accents. We came when I was 7 years old, and we moved to a small place called Papakaio near Oamaru, which is a very blink and you miss it as you drive by. So I went to a country school. You know, there was 30 people in the class. It was very small. And then we moved to Christchurch, and I grew up in Christchurch as well. Went to high school in Christchurch, went to Canterbury University, and then I worked for 3 years in Wellington at a national law firm. And then I met my wife in Wellington, so it's a special city for me. And we got married and moved to London and spent 3 years in London, then spent 4 years in Tokyo, 4 years in Sydney, and came back to New Zealand 3 years ago. And what I've been doing overseas was really working with big companies, big corporates, and I came back wanting to have a different approach. So since I've been back, I've been doing a lot of work in this sector that we all know, social enterprise. And as well as that, I work with lots of charities and not-for-profits. So that's kind of become an area I do a lot in, as well as my old hat of corporates and banks and mergers and company things as well. So that's just a little bit of my background so you know the context. And basically, it occurred to me, I kept meeting people in my job who were amazing. And they do amazing things, but they had no platform to tell their stories. So there was no one knew about them. And I thought, wouldn't it be great if there was a way that I could actually help to empower them to tell their story? And I'd been listening to podcasts myself as I was driving into work, in and out each day. And I thought, I wonder how difficult it is to start a podcast. And so that was the origin of it, was wanting to tell stories. Because I think podcasts are a great way to get stories out and to educate people in a very unique way. Because people, when they're listening to podcasts, we each have wasted time in our days. You know, when you're driving from A to B, or when you're mowing the lawn, or, you know, maybe cleaning or cooking or whatever it is, there's a lot of time in our day which is not productive. And so podcasts are a platform to allow people to listen. And I was reflecting on this. This is a bit of a long intro, but I've been thinking a lot about this. And really, when you look at humanity, up until relatively recently, not many people could even write. You know, like think of a couple hundred years ago, our ancestors probably were not able to write. So how did they communicate? It was through speaking and through telling stories. And I think in a way, podcasts are stripping back some of the modern ways and saying actually having a korero, having a story, listening to somebody's personal experience can be incredibly powerful. So that was my background for wanting to start a podcast. And I'm just going to run through some of the equipment that I use, and I'm going to run through some of the key things that I've learned as I've been going. And if you have questions, like I say, just jump in and ask. But the first thing for me was trying to decide what the theme of my podcast was actually going to be. And it sounds simple, but it's not. So originally, when I was thinking of, well, what would I name the podcast? It was actually a long process to come to the name Seeds. And I was originally thinking kind of more a longer title. But then I had these ideas like talking purpose, you know, like kind of that's what I want to do. I want to talk about purpose. And I found I'm so glad that I settled on Seeds because it's a conceptual thing that can get across a meaning and an impact without needing lots of words. Like, everybody knows what a seed is. It's simple. So if you're starting a podcast, I encourage you to spend a lot of time on that process of what are we going to call it? How are we going to convey in one simple word what we're about? So the background of seeds is that I love the idea that seeds look like they're dead. You can put them in a jar. There's no life. You put them in the ground. You give them water, light, nutrients, the right conditions, and what happens? They grow. And so for me, seeds, these stories that I'm telling through the podcast are like seeds, that if we plant them, if people listen to one of the episodes, there may be something that they resonate with that's like a seed that's planted for their life, and that may grow. And in the last session, we were talking about impact and how do you measure it, and it's a really hard thing to measure. So sometimes I feel like I'm scattering these seeds, and I don't know what's going to grow up. And maybe I won't know until 20 years from now when somebody comes back, maybe, and says, I listened to a podcast and it helped me to do whatever they did. So that's sort of how one thing to think about is just what are you naming it, and what's your target market, or who are you wanting to help? Who are you wanting to influence? So spend a lot of time on that is my advice. A question?
Thanks. Is that okay?
Yeah, that's fine. It'd be more fun if there's questions. So.
Oh, okay. I don't have a fun question. It's very serious.
Yeah, great.
So then, do you know who your audience is? Do you have a dialogue?
So, yep. We can talk about that. So basically, I started this podcast at the time of the Social Enterprise World Forum in Christchurch, and I launched it with an interview of Michelle Sharp from Kilmarnock Enterprises. So she's an amazing communicator and has a wonderful story. And episode number 1 is still one of my favorites. So Kilmarnock is a social enterprise that empowers people with different disabilities so that they can have employment. So it's a wonderful story, and she's great. She used to work for startups back in the UK, so hearing her journey was amazing. And so that really set the tone for what came. And so the audience from the beginning was sort of social enterprise focused, because it was at the time of the forum and people started listening from then. And so what you do basically is what I did is I started a Facebook page, and then I've gotten people liking the Facebook page. So right now there's about 400 likes, and so that's one way to communicate. And people, every time I post an episode, I'll say I spoke to Sister Mary Scanlon, who has been a nun for 70 years. She was born in 1929, and she works with palliative care. So that's not social enterprise at all, but it's interesting to me. And so then when I post that, people will like it. So that's one way to engage. And then the other way is that you'll need to get a host provider who can hold the audio. So you pay them and you upload your files, and they keep track of all downloads across all podcasting platforms. So I know exactly how many episodes, how much each episode has been listened to. I can log in, and it's a website, and it will tell me this episode has 237 listens as of right now. And today it's had 7 listens. And of those 7 listens, 3 were in the UK, 1 was in Argentina, 5 were, it tells you that level of detail, but it doesn't tell me who they are. So it's all aggregated. I don't know the identities. I do know, as of today, it's been listened to 23,000 times. So that's overall 85 episodes. So you have to do the averages, but it's several hundred per episode. But that's been building up. Like, I've been doing it for a year and a half. And my theory is, as new people find it, they'll then go back and start from the beginning and get the content. So over time, it should have increased listeners, because there's 85 hours of material now that people can go back and listen to. Yeah, Joe, did you have
So one's a technical question and one's a content question. So the technical question, so does that aggregation that holds all the content then feed and are you on iTunes and SoundCloud and all of the different places you can put content?
Yeah.
Does that serve them all?
Yeah, so the question, I'm just going to repeat it so the listeners can hear it as well. The question is whether that host pushes it out to all the podcasting platforms. And the answer is partly it does, but you have to sign up for which ones you want it to go to. So there's it's my one, it goes to, the host that I've chosen is called Libsyn, Libsyn, and Libsyn is one of the most commonly used podcast hosting platforms, if not the most commonly. Like it's straightforward, it's easy, there's a certain charge per month, and that's it. And then, so they then give you a free website, and that website you can then give to people to go listen to it. But you can also set up what's called an RSS feed, and the RSS feed is what then gets channeled to Apple Podcasts, Spotify. So I think my one's on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, one called One Republic, Podbean. There's about 7 or 8 different ones. And from when I was setting it up, the key thing for me was I wanted it to be available on Apple phones and Android phones. So I tried to get some podcast apps that were Android so that other people, could listen to it. And it's on the website as well. And then what I've done a month ago was set up a dedicated website just for this podcast called theseeds.nz. And I then take each podcast and I load it onto that site as well. So you try to spread it out as much as you can. But ultimately, it sometimes depends on the person I interviewed, whether they go to their social media and post about it or put it on LinkedIn or whatever.
Beautiful segue to the second question.
Okay.
Which is,
Yep.
around the content. So I don't know whether it's different now to when you started it, but you said something before about the nun that you interviewed. You said it's something that I'm personally interested in.
Yeah.
So are you, like as a content creator, when you work in publishing or whatever, you kind of focus on what the customer wants and deliver that?
Yeah.
And you were very specific that I was interested in that, and it was, probably an amazing conversation. I haven't listened to it. So, do you do that? Do you focus on what you're interested in?
So the question is whether I focus on what I'm interested in or what I think the listener will be interested in, to summarize it. And so this is where it gets interesting, because you can get too worried about what your listeners want to hear. I feel like I don't make any money from this podcast. Like, there's no advertising revenue. If it grew to be like some of you would listen to, the big Joe Rogan, and there's millions of downloads and things, that would be a different scenario. But I'm actually trying to empower a sector within a country, so it's kind of a different reason for doing it. I'm not really doing it for the money. So also, it's much more fun if you enjoy doing it. And I like finding people that I think have interesting stories to tell, and then I will focus on them. So the nun who turned 90 and was born in 1929, I loved hearing about the Great Depression. I loved hearing about the time that World War II was announced on the radio. And so that interested me. So I thought, I'm just going to do it. But actually, the themes that she ended up talking about, which is lots about love, caring for other people, working as a nurse for 70 years, resonates really strongly with the social enterprise sector. So there's no conflict. And what happens is, once you've done it enough, you start learning how to ask good questions. And so you're able to draw out the stories of people. Yeah.
Have you ever interviewed anybody that you didn't like?
No, I haven't interviewed anybody I didn't like. No. Yeah. I mean, the key thing, so this is good to remember. Something that my mother told me when I was growing up is that there's no uninteresting person. If you think they're uninteresting, it's because you haven't asked the right question yet. And so that's always stuck with me, and it's really informed this podcast, because I always look at the person, and we'll touch on this, but I only interview in person. I've never done a Skype interview or something like that, but I'll look in their eyes and ask them the questions, because within them, there will be a story. And if they haven't been able to articulate it yet, it's because I haven't asked the right question yet. And so that's the challenge as the interviewer is, what's the hidden gem that you haven't revealed yet? How do I get it?
Which is slightly different to whether you like them.
Yeah, well, that's true.
If
Yeah,
they're being interesting,
yeah,
who don't like him.
yeah. No, but all the people I've interviewed, I've enjoyed the conversations. Yeah.
How much research do you do on them before?
Yeah, it's a good question. Some people who are podcasters do lots and lots of research, and they go into the interview and they'll be like, in your book, you said at chapter 10, blah, blah, blah. I actually don't like to do that because I like the interview to be like, I've just met you, and we're learning about each other. I feel like it's more authentic than trying to impress the listener with sort of how much research I've done. So I will know something about the people, enough to get the conversation started. That's why I've asked them to be on the podcast. There has to be some reason, but I won't know everything, partly because I want to discover it in the same way that the listener is discovering it.
It's a bit more authentic as you go.
It's much more authentic, yeah. And also, sometimes when you start the podcast, before you've hit record, you'll start hearing stories. And so I always try to say, stop, let's just start recording. Let's get all of it. I want to capture everything. So the other day I interviewed Lisa Mead, and she started an accounting firm that gives 10% of the profits back into charities and not-for-profits. So it's a really cool concept. And about 4 minutes in, I was like, so tell me a bit about your childhood. Oh, I was into running and sports until my appendix burst and I was hospitalized for 6 months. It's like, oh, I didn't know. My reaction is just as authentic as anybody. And she describes how she had to go to hospital, how she was in a room and she felt like she was no longer in her body. Like it gets really like, whoa, I had no idea. I thought we were talking about setting up an accounting firm. So the surprise element of it is it makes it more real. And I enjoy it more as well. Like, I don't want it. That's the other thing. When you start, you might want to have a script, because sometimes the people you're interviewing will say, what are you going to ask me? So initially I used to send them like 7 questions, and then, and then some of them would prepare and things. But now I've done it so many times, I say, look, it's just a natural conversation. Just pretend the microphone isn't there. I just want to get to know you. Rather than, okay, we're up to number 4 now. Oh, now we're up to, what was number 5? It's artificial.
So do you ever find yourself doing much editing or any at all?
I try not to edit as much as possible because I want it to be authentic. If I feel it will enhance their story, I will take out some parts. And I tell them, the other thing is I'm transparent with them. And I think this is really key. You can edit the content later, so you can assure them, if you say something you didn't mean to, if you tell a story you regret tomorrow, email me and tell me and I will delete it. So there's a trust between you and the person you're interviewing. I'm not there to ambush them. I'm not an investigative journalist trying to get to the bottom of something. I want them to tell their story. So if I've had this happen, where people have emailed me later and say, that bit I said about my brother and how he was really mean to me in childhood, can we just delete that? Because I just don't want him to hear that. You know what I mean? So that's part of the trusting relationship between you and the person you're interviewing. And you do get better as you go on. So I always tell them there's 2 parts to the interview. In the first part, I'm going to be asking you about you. And the second part, I'm going to be asking about what you do. And I actually was reminded by somebody that this is actually kind of a Te Ao Māori sort of perspective, looking at the person as a whole, rather than what do you do? Like in Western culture, very often, what's the first question we ask, right? What do you do? Rather than who are you? Where do you come from? So in the podcast, what I try to do is start at the very beginning and say, where are you from? So most conversations I'll begin, tell me where you're from. And then they interpret that the way they want to. Many times they'll say, well, I was born in Christchurch and then we moved to Auckland and then blah, blah, blah. And then sometimes and you hear it sometimes in the interviews, they'll speed up and they'll go, and then I graduated and I went to Auckland University, I became a physiotherapist, and it's like 30 seconds, because that's what Western culture is about. You got to get out your story as quickly as possible. And then I'll say, oh, that's really interesting. Can we just back up a bit? What did you enjoy when you were 6 years old? Let's step back. What were you like as a child? Then what did you enjoy studying in high school? How did you choose what you studied at university if you went there? What was your first job? And try to slow it down. So the first 20 or 25 minutes, in a way, I'm wasting a lot of time because I'm getting the whole backstory of the person's life. But what they're doing now is so informed by that first part that you can't really understand what they're doing now unless you know that their mother helped foster children. And what are they doing today? Oh, you're working with people who have difficult situations. So you can actually start to see a themes through the life that becomes unveiled as you go. Whereas if I just said, so Michelle Sharp, you're the CEO of Kilmarnock Enterprises, what's on your horizon? What's the next challenge you're facing? It's way less impactful than, oh, so you spent your childhood in Mexico. What was that culture like? What do you think it did for you that in Latin culture, it's very much about supporting each other, and how does that feed into what you're doing now with these people with different disabilities? So that's the thing, is you have to try to, well, in my view, you try to unpack the story and get as deep as you possibly can with people. So we were chatting about this before, just the length of the podcast. The longest one I've ever done is 1 hour and 35 minutes. So I'm doing what's called a long form podcast, but hopefully you can tell I'm actually interested in people's backstory, where they're from. It's a bit trendy, but why? What's your why? But you get to unpack that through understanding that story. But this is a choice. If you choose to do it, you'll have to make a choice. Actually, no, I want to go for an 18-minute podcast. I'm going to go for the TED Talk. That's how long people's attention spans are. And I'm sure I've lost listeners, or people have looked at the length and thought, oh, I don't have 1 hour and a half. Whereas if I'd done it 20 minutes, maybe I would have got them. But I'm after quality rather than, I guess I want quality and quantity.
Have you done, so all your episodes, they kind of sound self-contained. Mm-hmm. Have you done podcasts that have kind of built a narrative in episodes? In the podcast, because I've interviewed all of them, obviously, so I will often refer back. So I'll be talking with someone and then I'll say, wow, this really reminds me of the community-owned garden initiative in Christchurch, which Peter Wells is running. And then we'll talk a little bit about that. So I do that. And then the other thing is that I've actually asked 2 former guests to come back and interview each other, because I thought they would have great stories. So Tim Jones, who does a lot with B Corp, and Mark Ambundo, who's from Africa and has been in New Zealand for a year. His interview is all about what he observes about New Zealand culture. And Tim gave up the corporate world to go into B Corp. So it was this fascinating conversation. I called it a mashup. And they interview each other, and I'm not even there. So that was really fun. And that's the thing, if it's your podcast, you can do whatever you want. So I'm not even in that episode at all, and they're just having fun talking. And then, but and then the one other thing I've done is a compilation episode, which was called The Moment Things Changed. And I pulled out from 10 different interviews, the 2 or 3 minutes where somebody said, this was the moment I was sitting on a park bench and I realized I needed to do ... So I compiled all those together. And if I had more time, I would do more of that stuff. Yeah.
How do you go about getting feedback, or what is feedback for podcasts? Because I can imagine that people might have comments or things that are like, oh, this inspired me about, from listening to the podcast. Do you share an email? Does that work?
Yeah, so the question is, how do I get feedback? So I do have this Facebook page. So if I post an episode, sometimes people will put a comment like, wow, that was great, I really appreciated it. honestly, you don't get much feedback. But I know how many people are listening to it. And like last week, in one day, it was listened to 147 times. So that's 147 people who heard me talking about purpose and business and the why. I can't talk to 147 people for an hour each in a day, you know. So I see the statistics and I think it is having impact. And then I do get emails in from people who say, wow, this really helped. And so I had one, I'll share two of them. One, somebody said I was at a career decision point and I listened to some of the podcasts and it helped me get clarity about what I should do next in my career. So that was really cool. And then probably the one that sustained me the most is I interviewed a guy who had terminal brain cancer. So that was in December. We knew he had it, and he died 2 months later. So we talk about what do you do when you get this sort of news. So it's about, that one's about normalizing the reality of death, which is 100% success rate for all of us, but we don't talk about it. So with him, I was able to, like, we're kind of crying at the end of the episode. It's that level of, like, we go really deep because it's, how do you cope with this? The point is, after he died, I went to his funeral and his son wrote me an email a month later and said, thank you so much for interviewing my father. When you did, now we have a record of his voice that we can pass on to his grandchildren, who, there's no grandchildren right now, but one day in the future, because we've captured an hour of his life and this will be something we can have as a legacy. So that, like, keeps me going. That's kept me going a long time. But it is really, it can be tiring. I think like any entrepreneurial type of thing, like I don't make money from this, but in a way it's a startup. And it can, you do wonder, what impact am I having? But when I think about 23,000 listens, that sustains me as well. Like that's a lot of impact.
How do you find your subjects? Are you constantly find yourself scouting for talent, or you know?
Yeah. So how do I find people to interview?
Yeah.
So it started with people in my own circle who I knew, and then they said, you should talk to this person, and then they said you should talk to this person. So it's like a ripple that goes out. And I've recently, so this is on the self-sustaining piece. For 1.5 years, I did one every Tuesday. So that involves interviewing someone, editing it, getting it ready, writing a description, and uploading it. So every week is a lot of work. So I've recently switched to doing it every 2 weeks, because I think now there's 85 episodes. People can go back into the archive and they can listen to them. And I don't need to burn out in the short term. I want this to be something I'm doing 5 or 10 years from now. So I'm not interviewing as many people as well. Yeah, but I have about 12 that I've interviewed that are already recorded. So that's about 3 or 4 months worth. So that's really nice because I don't have the pressure. And if you are starting one and you're interviewing people, I recommend getting at least 3 or 4 done before you release your first one. Otherwise, you'll feel real pressure. You'll release number 1 and everyone will go, wow, that was amazing. When's number 2? And it's a big pressure. So I did about 4 or 5 before I released the first one.
So if you're doing the first one, how do you, you've got some technical equipment here.
Yeah, well, I'd love to share about it. Yeah. So the technical equipment that you need is a microphone and a recording device. Like it's that simple. But I respect the listener, and I wanted to get high quality audio equipment, because if people are with me for the hour that they're listening to the podcast, I want it to be a quality experience for them. So your iPhone can record audio, and maybe in the future it will be even higher quality. But I really wanted to get a device that would do even radio quality. So I bought this, which is called a Zoom H4n Pro. So this is used for making movies and things. Like it's a top quality device and it records at, it's radio quality. So when I was setting up the podcast, I went in Christchurch, there's a radio station called Plains FM, which is like an access radio. And I showed them this and they said, this is actually probably better than our equipment that we loan to people to go out. So So it's a really nice piece of equipment. So the cost of it was $395, but I viewed that as an investment of, I respect the listener, its quality, and you can just record for years and years. It's not going to go out of style. So for the tech people who will know more than me, this has 2 XLR inputs. So that's really high quality that comes from this microphone. And it also has these microphones here, so at the front, so you can switch it, and then it would pick up all the audio in the room. These microphones, so that's the device, and it's got an SD card. So I got like a huge one, like I think it's 64 gigabyte SD card. So I can literally record like 25 hours of content. They're quite large file sizes. They're almost a gigabyte for an hour. But anyway, that's the device that I bought. And this has recording levels, so you can adjust the sound. So I've set this, so hopefully it will be picking up my voice at a good level. And if you get it wrong, though, it could be too high. And I'll talk about the software in a second. And then the microphone, this is called a Rode microphone. And so RODE is the brand. And it's called a dynamic microphone, which means it picks up the sound in this area right here. So in theory, the questions you've been asking me, they probably aren't being picked up. Whereas if you have a condenser microphone, it will pick up everything in the room. The reality is this microphone is really, really good. And so often I have to say to the guests, it's going to pick up that tapping on the table. So I try, if the guest is wearing clothing that will make sounds, maybe a jacket or something, it might pay to ask them to just, wear non-noisy clothing, because it does pick it up. It picks up everything. So the audio for this is going to be very poor quality because of all the surrounding sounds in the kitchen and, the little dee-dee-dee-dee. It's going to pick up everything.
How much did you spend on the microphones?
They were $295 each. So all up, it was $1,000 for everything. But I feel like it's all portable. So it all fits in a plastic tub that I can then take to the guest. So I never force them to come to me. I always say, I can meet you wherever you want to meet. So the sister that I mentioned, the 90-year-old sister, I went to her apartment and I set it up and we sat at her kitchen table. So it was her context. She was comfortable. She was able to say, that's the picture of Mary Potter, the founder of the Little Company of Mary, which is the order that she's part of. So, yeah. And also that way, like when I went to Japan, I used to live in Japan, so I interviewed my former kind of host father about his life, what it was like growing up in World War II in Japan, so I was able to take it all with me. So, yeah, and I brought it all today, so this is it. And then the other thing is it does have, normally I would put these on to be able to monitor the sound, and because if you come closer it gets louder, and if you're further away so I have a splitter, which means I can have two headphones, so the guest can have one and I can have one, and we can kind of try to keep our levels at about the same. So that's kind of the equipment. I recommend if you do get one of these, this is like a case that's all padded, so that didn't come with it. It only came with this. But if you drop it, it's better to have it in this. And then once you've done your interview, you have an audio file. And what I do, I have a Mac computer, and I've downloaded a software program called Audacity. And Audacity is a free software program, so it's very cheap. And you basically then drag your sound file into Audacity, and it shows you the sound levels and things. So then you can adjust how it's sounding, and you can make it louder or quieter, depending on what you do. And then what I have is I record an introduction and an outro. So every time I'll say, I'm really glad you could join me today. I'm speaking with Carrie Bonner about promoting access to those who have disabilities. So Carrie has cerebral palsy, and we talked about what it's like for her, what her life is like. So that would be the little intro. And then usually I'll say, here's an extract from our conversation. And I'll put like 30 seconds at the start to give a flavor of it. And then I'll say some sort of a message about, you know, if you like it, then subscribe, leave a rating, that type of thing. And now let's get into the conversation. And then at the end, I'll do something that says, I hope you enjoyed that conversation. If you liked it, there's 85 other interviews. Thanks for listening. Until next time. Yeah, you got a question?
So I noticed you have a camera over here. What might that be used for?
Yeah, so I've set this camera up. This is called a Mevo camera, and sometimes I'll video interview my podcast interviews. So the podcast is audio only, so that's what this is. But sometimes I'm in the process of uploading more to YouTube as a channel for the podcast. So right now, this camera is recording, so you can see on my phone there. That's actually recording right now, and it's an amazing piece of equipment because it records in 4K, which is really high quality. And it actually, if I set it to, it would find faces, and it would jump from my face over to someone else and back to me, and panning shot, all as I'm filming. So yeah, it's an amazing, it shows technology is moving forward quickly. Yeah. That, so I got that in America, so I think it was about $600. Yeah.
But it's got AI in it so that it can actually find
It actually finds faces, yeah. So if anybody's interested, my actual job is as a lawyer, and I've done some training about things that startups should know. And in that training, I did some juggling, and I used that camera to film the whole thing. And so that goes to my face and then wider and then back to my friend and back to me. And so it's an amazing piece of kit if you've got some money. But video is kind of the way of the future, I think. So audio, I think, has a huge resurgence right now, but video I want to be ready to do as well.
It's
Yeah.
kind of nice to watch the video like Joe Rogan and stuff because you're in the room.
Right.
There's two people.
Yeah. Yeah, you had a
So I'd
question?
like to know, I'm very interested to know, what can you learn from the data that's available about audience behaviour? And four things have come up for me. One would be any difference in behaviour around the video compared to sound. One is, are they going back through the back catalogue, you know, to find, and what can you learn from the journey that they take?
Yeah.
Another question is, okay, so you quite luxurious in how much time you take to get to the bottom of the story, but what are you learning from your statistics about how long people stay on average?
Yeah.
Recording? And then the fourth one was, what are the topics that you interest?
Yeah. So there's many questions there, but I'll just answer some of them. So this is a hobby for me, so I don't have the money to be able to really just focus on getting the answers to all of those things. I know from looking at the statistics that people definitely do go back and they are listening to the archive because it breaks it down month by month for each episode. So I can tell how many listens there were this month and how many there were the previous month for each episode. So like episode number 1, obviously it spiked when it first came out, but even over time it still has listens, you know, like 5 or 6 over a certain period. Like I think over a month it might get 10 listens. So that's 10 people who've gone back. But it is hard for me to know who those people are. I don't know.
Track the visitor journey back.
Not really, no. I get feedback from people who say, because my hope, you see, is that someone will listen to one episode and then they'll go, because it will be their friend, you know, like, you know, their brother gets interviewed or whatever. Oh, I'll listen to it because it's my brother. Actually, I kind of like that. I'll go back and listen to other ones. That's my theory. So that every episode I'll be gaining more listeners who are then looking back into the archive and realizing there's a lot of great content there.
So what about visitor engagement? How long are they staying? What are the topics that they're particularly interested in?
Yeah, well, so it depends. It actually depends how much the guests help to promote it. Because if you imagine their networks, I can't tap into their networks. but if they post about it on Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, if they email if it's in their newsletters going out, then it will rise. Yep. So, and I can track that. I know it rises because, like at the Social Enterprise Conference at the Wellington Zoo, I did some sessions. I interviewed some people and just had the audio, and I posted those as episodes, and then Akina put it in their newsletter, and so then people were cooking, and then that episode was being listened to. But it is it's an inexact science from my perspective, and all I can do is really, hopefully people like you will become engaged, and then you'll tell a friend, and then they'll tell a friend. It really is sort of that grassroots level, because I just don't have I've tried Facebook sponsorship, so that, if you do a post, you can boost it, but you quickly burn through a lot of money that way. So I don't really do that. I just rely on word of mouth, and And the other thing is, in Apple Podcasts, people can leave ratings and reviews. So I'm up to, I think, 39 ratings and reviews now, which is quite good, given that I don't know how many people there are listening. But 39 people have gone to the effort, and it only takes about 30 seconds. And I'd encourage you all to do it. But you go in and you literally just swipe across with the star thing, and there's a rating. So I appeal for that in the show. I'll say, I'd appreciate if you can leave a rating and review, subscribe, leave a comment at the Facebook page. Yeah.
Stephen, I'm curious, and I've sort of noticed you're very measured and articulate speaker, and very, not using ums and ahs. Did you find that going through this process, as you spend more time, do you become a lot more aware of your speaking patterns?
Yeah, so the question is whether I become aware of speaking patterns, and yes, I think you do, and you learn when to just be quiet and let the person talk. I think it's a lost art in Western culture of listening. I think we all have lots of things to say, but it's very rare to find people who actually don't say the next thing and just let that uncomfortable pause hang a little bit longer. And that sometimes is when the guest will then say the actual thing, that has substance. Giving them the space to do that, not rushing to the next topic. And in terms of how I speak and things, I'm not sure. It's just the way I talk. But I'd encourage you to just be authentic with however you speak. There's one of my favorite podcasts is called On Being, with Krista Tippett, and so she's an American who interviews people kind of similar themes to me, in that she's talking about big picture stuff, life and death and faith and spirituality and the future and all that type of stuff. But I've noticed that she pauses and has lots of and it's her way. It's authentic to who she is, and it works. So just don't worry too much. Just be yourself, right? But over time, you do get better at waiting and pausing. And the big thing is that you have to learn to listen with your heart. It sounds kind of silly, but you have to actually see through what people are saying to the core of what they're actually saying. And then your next question will hopefully draw it out more. So they might say something like, my father had a big influence on me or something. And then your next question is, tell me more about your father. What exactly was it about him that you appreciated? So going that extra question rather than letting it hang.
So when you're doing a podcast or you're wanting to tell a story, you really should have someone who's conducting the interview who knows nothing about you. So finding the right interviewer is really going to be one of the bigger challenges, to be able to articulate your story.
I think so finding the right interviewer and how important that is. I think it is a big part, because you're setting up an intimate relationship with this person, and it is key that they trust each other. And I guess I'm fortunate that I'm able to listen in an empathetic way to people. I think that's a I think I was maybe born with it, but I've also learned it. So you do have to have that, because ultimately this is a conversation where they're trusting you with their life story and you have to respect it. And so there is a lot to be said for who does the interview.
As an example, was Cosmo Kentish Barnes in the countrywide program on Radio New Zealand. He has that ability to draw out, and he ended up with some fascinating stories from throughout New Zealand in a rural environment.
Yeah.
And it seems to be a rare talent, because most interviewers seem to have an agenda which they're wanting to overlay to the person they're interviewing.
Yeah, whereas my agenda is I want to help enhance their story. I want to get the best out of them. I want to really get to the heart of who they are and understand why they do what they do. So that's underpinning, that's the foundation. And the fascinating thing is across all 85 interviews, you definitely start to hear themes and trends which come through for everybody. And often there's an event or something happens where the person realized that their time on Earth was limited, and that could be the death of a loved one, it could be a diagnosis, it could be going overseas, whatever it is. There's something where they switched in their brain and thought, what am I doing with my life? How can I add value? So, yeah. You had a question?
Have you ever found any occasions, either for you personally or any of your guests, interviewees, on a podcast with Truly Facts, that they, so they've basically told you what they think and how they think. Have you ever had a situation where you said something maybe in real life, go, I don't like the way you think, and take issue with what the content of that podcast was about?
No, I haven't really had, so the question is whether I've had people take issue with the content in the podcast. I haven't really had that, to be honest. I think probably if people don't like it, they just stop listening, and that's fine. And they can listen to another podcast. They can listen to Joe Rogan or whoever.
Well, he gets that a lot. Right?
Yeah.
Like, I don't like the content of that podcast.
Yeah.
But then he has millions and millions.
Yeah, I think enough people like it where I'm comfortable enough in my own skin with it now where it's okay. Yeah, I don't mind, And the other thing is, even if only 2 or 3 people listen to it, it still would have impact. As long as those 2 or 3 people have learned something and grown through it, then I feel like I've added some value. So when I get 147 people in a day, it's like, wow, that's cool. But equally, if there's 5 or 6 people, I don't know, but maybe that one person was really impacted, So you have to have a bigger picture. I like the stuff we're talking about with impact. You have to be able to see beyond the limited horizon of, I got 27 listens today. No, actually the impact is 10 years from now when someone comes up to me and says, that particular episode helped me. I forgot to tell you, but it was really cool. So, yeah. But if people are listening and they'd like to give me feedback, it's always encouraging. Yeah. So I might wrap up there because I think we're coming to the end.
Just
But,
the camera, you've got it set up. Would you, going forward, would you use that all the time?
It's a case of my own capacity. I don't have time to edit the audio and the video and upload it and things. So
If you did?
if I had capacity, yes, I would do that, because I feel like it's another way to communicate with people is with the video. The other thing, if I had time and money, and if anyone's listening wants to volunteer, transcribing the episodes. Some people, even last night I was talking to someone who said, I don't do podcasts, I will read a transcript. So the content is there. If I had somebody who could help me to transcribe even bits of the podcast, it would be incredibly valuable to get out as content into the world. But I just don't have capacity to. I've done a couple episodes and typed them out, but yeah.
So 2 things.
Yeah. Advertise for someone to help on Collaborate. Maybe I will. Yeah, it's a good idea.
2 things. One is I can show you how, and
Okay.
secondly, since you're recording, tell us the funniest thing that's ever happened to you.
Oh, okay. Well, it would be great to have people assist. The funniest thing that's happened in an interview. it's probably due to technical difficulties where the equipment stops working, but I think it's working. So we're talking, and then I look and it's like, ooh, sorry, can we go back and redo that? Yeah, that's happened before. So always double check that it's actually recording. This particular device, you have to hit it twice to actually record. Yeah. So just to finish, thanks for coming along to the session. I appreciate your time. I brought some business cards which talk about the podcast. I'd appreciate it if you could take a couple and give them to people that you think would benefit. I'm trying to get it out into places that I will never reach. And each of you are from places that I will probably, I don't go to the same places. So it'd be great if you're willing to be unofficial ambassadors. I'm looking for more people to help spread the word about it. But thank you very much. I appreciate your time. And that was 50 minutes.